The stars in Kerith's belt had always been quiet. It was a stretch of deep space sitting at the far edge of what most galactic maps labeled human-adjacent territory. Nothing important lived there. A few cold rocks, some gas clouds that glowed faintly in the dark, and silence. The kind of silence that had been unbroken for millions of years. Then the Valthari arrived, and the silence died forever. They did not come quietly. Nothing about the Valthari was quiet. Their ships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a wave, one after another, like enormous black stones falling into still water. The space around Kerith's belt shuddered. Sensor arrays across 3 star systems lit up with warnings. Communications networks across the Galactic Council crackled and buzzed as automated systems tried to process what they were seeing and failed. There were 7 of them. 7 ascendant arcs. Each one was the size of a small moon. They moved slowly, to deliberately, the way something moves when it has no reason to hurry. Their hulls were wrapped in a shimmering energy field that absorbed light and bent it, making the ships look like holes cut into the fabric of space itself. When they positioned themselves in a wide arc above the plane of the belt, they blocked out 3 stars between them. Darkness spread across the sensor readings like ink. The message came 4 minutes after their arrival. It was transmitted on every known frequency, in every documented language spoken by any species in the galaxy. The translation was perfect in all of them. Whoever had sent it had taken the time to make sure every living thing that received it would understand every word. It said, "We are the Valthari. We were ancient before your suns ignited. We were great before your worlds cooled. We have walked the stars for 40,000 years, and we have seen everything that lives and everything that dies. We are the beginning, and we are the end. And we are what you have always called gods, because that is what we are. Kneel before us and you will be preserved. You will be cataloged, protected, and allowed to continue in your small lives under our grace. Resist us and you will be erased. Not defeated, not conquered, erased. You have 48 hours to transmit your formal surrender. We will wait." Then the message ended and the silence came back. But it was a different kind of silence now, a heavier one. When the Galactic Council chamber on Station Veyrath 9 had never been louder. 31 species were represented in that chamber, and all of them were speaking at once. The Dorathi, whose 4 arms each moved independently when they were frightened, were a blur of motion. The tall, thin Kaylee were pressed into the back corners of their seats, their wide yellow eyes fixed on the transmission data scrolling across the central display. The Sin, small and gray-skinned, with fingers like wire, each were pulling up historical records and projecting them into the air above their section of the chamber, filling the room with old images that nobody wanted to see. Images of dead worlds, because the Valthari had been here before, not recently and not here exactly, but they had passed through this part of the galaxy 12,000 years ago. They had left a record, though not an intentional one. The record was the absence of civilizations that had once existed. On planets that old survey records showed as inhabited now had nothing on them but ruins and silence. Species that had been cataloged and noted by ancient explorers were simply gone. No war debris, no mass graves, no signs of exodus, just gone. Ambassador Sithari of the Rethian Federation stood at his designated position in the chamber and tried to make his voice heard above the noise. He was a tall reptilian being, covered in dark green scales with pale yellow markings along his neck. He had served as a diplomat for 31 years. He had handled border disputes, resource conflicts, and one very complicated situation involving a rogue AI on the outer marchlands. He had never, in all his years, felt the particular sensation he was feeling now, which was the cold and specific feeling of knowing that everyone in the room was going to die if someone did not do something very smart very quickly. He finally got the chamber to quiet down by activating his floor panel 3 times in rapid succession, which triggered the formal call to order tone. "We have 48 hours, he said when the room was still. "Arguing is not a use of that time. We need to decide collectively whether we are submitting or requesting extended negotiation terms. The historical record suggests that the Valthari do not negotiate, but submitting immediately may demonstrate willingness to cooperate, and which may improve the conditions of. The humans have responded. The voice came from a junior communications officer seated at the far end of the data station. She was a young Kaylee, and her voice was barely above a whisper, but the room had gone so quiet that everyone heard it. Sithari turned slowly. "What did you say?" "The humans," she repeated, her yellow eyes wide. "They transmitted a response to the Valthari. 4 minutes ago, directly on the same frequencies the Valthari used." The room went very still. "What did they say?" Sithari asked. The Kaylee officer read from her screen carefully, clearly wanting to make sure she got every word exactly right. "They said, identify your vessel class, weapons configuration, and command hierarchy. You have entered a contested zone. Withdraw or be engaged." The silence that followed was not the kind of silence that comes from calm. It was the kind that comes from shock so complete that nobody could find a word for several seconds. Then the Dorathi ambassador made a sound that, in his language, roughly translated to a very old expression that meant something had gone very wrong. Aboard the UES Unbroken Meridian, things were calm. The Unbroken Meridian was a sovereign-class battleship, one of 11 in the human fleet. It was not the largest human ship. It was not the newest. But it was well-maintained, well-crewed, and it was currently sitting at a full combat station about 2 light hours from the Valthari formation. Its long-range passive sensor arrays drinking in every signal, every drive emission, and every particle trail the 7 arcs were producing. Admiral Mara Voss stood at the center of the bridge and looked at the data. She was not a dramatic-looking person. She was medium height, with short dark hair going gray at the edges. And she had the kind of face that did not move much when she was thinking. She had been in the fleet for 22 years. She had seen 3 small conflicts, 1 border enforcement action that nearly became a war, and 1 actual war that lasted 6 years and ended with a treaty that nobody was fully happy with, which she had always considered a sign that it was a fair treaty. She had never seen anything like the 7 ships now sitting in Kareth's belt. She had read the Council's historical records on the Valthari during the 3-day burn from the nearest human way station. She had read them twice. She had made notes. Now she looked at the data streams from her passive arrays and she made more notes. "They're not scanning us aggressively," said Lieutenant Commander Priya Anand, her sensor chief from the station to Voss's left. "They're not scanning much of anything. They dropped in, positioned, and transmitted. And that's it." "They don't think they need to scan," Voss said. "Why would they? Everyone's always surrendered before. Command is asking us to pull back to the threshold line," said her communications officer, Ensign Dale. He was young and he was doing a very good job of keeping his voice level. "Galactic Council has requested that we refrain from any transmissions that could be interpreted as provocative." "Noted," said Voss. "Should I transmit acknowledgement to command?" "Transmit acknowledgement to command," she said. "Don't move the ship." Ensign Dale processed that for a moment. "Admiral, that's 2 different things," Voss said, not unkindly. "We can acknowledge the order and continue gathering data. We haven't moved to engage. We've asked them to identify themselves. That's standard contact protocol. We're following procedure." She looked back at her screens. The Valthari ships were enormous. On the visual display, the sensor-rendered image showed them as vast, dark shapes hanging in space, almost beautiful in the way that very dangerous things sometimes were. She did not find them frightening. She found them interesting. On the lead Valthari Ark, Eternity's Throne, the Supreme Archon Velshareth read the human transmission and experienced something he had not experienced in a very long time. He was ancient, even by Valthari standards. His body was the shape of a large insect. Way if insects could grow to the size of a ground vehicle and wrap themselves in living armor grown from their own biology over centuries. His 4 eyes, each a deep and luminous amber, had seen the rise and fall of civilizations the way a human might watch seasons change. He moved slowly. He spoke slowly. He had not been in any hurry for roughly 8,000 years. He read the human message a second time. "Identify your vessel class, weapons configuration, and command hierarchy. Hana, you have entered a contested zone. Withdraw or be engaged." Around him in the high conclave chamber, 6 other senior Valthari stood or sat in their preferred positions. They were all watching him, waiting for his response to the message. After a very long moment, Velsharath made a sound. It took the others a moment to realize it was laughter. He was laughing. "Pull the records on this species," he said, when the laughter had settled. "The ones who sent this message." An attendant moved to the archive systems. The search took longer than expected because the Valthari archive was 40,000 years deep, and the species in question was barely listed. The attendant had to search by location rather than name, triangulating from the signal's point of origin. The file that came back was thin, embarrassingly thin. A few survey entries from roughly 600 years ago, noting the presence of a young bipedal species on a single world in an unremarkable star system. Recent updates showed they had colonized several nearby systems and developed functional faster-than-light travel approximately 400 years ago. 400 years. The Valthari had been traveling the stars for 40,000. "Dispatch the chastening fleet," Velsharath said, his tone returning to its usual slow and settled patience. "Not the primary wings. The third rotation will do. This is a correction, not a campaign. Let them learn what they are before we proceed with the Council's surrender processing." He set the human message down and turned to look out at the stars through the great viewport of Eternity's throne. He did not think about the humans again. Sithari arrived at the unbroken meridian via a small diplomatic shuttle that the human crew brought in through a side bay with quiet efficiency. And a young officer in a clean uniform met him at the docking collar, offered him water and a translation module, and walked him through corridors that were busier than he had expected, but not panicked. That was the first thing that struck him. No panic. He had just come from a council chamber where 31 species were in various states of open despair. Here, people were moving with purpose, speaking in short sentences, checking screens and moving on to the next thing. A few of them glanced at him with curiosity, but most did not. They had work to do. He was brought to a room with a long table and a view of the stars outside, and Admiral Voss came in 2 minutes later with a cup of something hot in her hand and a data tablet under her arm. She sat down across from him, set the tablet on the table, and said, "Ambassador, thank you for making the trip. What can I do for you?" Sethari had prepared a careful speech. He had a presentation of the historical record, organized chronologically, showing the 17 confirmed instances of civilizations being erased following contact with the Valthari. He had statistics on fleet strength comparisons. He had a moral argument about the responsibility of a species with military capability to avoid actions that would bring destruction down on all surrounding peoples. He looked at Voss, at her calm, dark eyes and her steady expression, and he decided to say the simple version instead. "Admiral," he said, "they are gods, and we are going to surrender, and I am begging you to let us do that without making things worse." Voss took a slow sip of her drink. She set the cup down. She looked at him for a moment. "Tell me," she said, "in all 17 of those extinction events in your records, how many of those species fired first?" Sithari paused. He thought about it. "None of them. They all submitted." Voss nodded slowly, like he had just confirmed something she already suspected. "Well, that's what I thought," she said. She opened her tablet and turned it around to show him the sensor data her ship had been quietly collecting for hours. Emissions readings, drive signatures, power cycling intervals, shield frequency rotations. A detailed technical portrait of 7 ships whose crews had never once thought they might need to hide what they were doing. "They've never needed to be careful," Voss said. "Nobody's ever looked at them this closely before. Because everyone was too busy panicking." She tapped one line of data. "Their chastening fleet is already moving. 14 ships by the drive count. They'll be here in about 6 days. Sethari stared at the data. Then he stared at her. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Mara Voss picked up her cup again and looked out the viewport at the distant dark shapes of the Valthari arcs. "Study," she said simply. 6 days was not a lot of time. But Mara Voss had always believed that what you did with time mattered more than how much of it you had. She had learned this lesson the hard way, years ago in a different conflict, when she had wasted 3 days waiting for orders that never came and almost lost her ship because of it. She had never waited for orders like that again. So while the Galactic Council debated and the 14 ships of the Valthari chastening fleet moved steadily through deep space toward Kareth's belt, with the unbroken meridian worked, the ship's passive sensor arrays never stopped running. They drank in every signal the approaching fleet produced, every drive pulse, every heat signature, every micro-emission from weapon systems warming up or cooling down. The Meridian's two senior sensor officers worked in 8-hour rotations so that the analysis never paused. Lieutenant Commander Annan built a detailed model of each of the 14 ships. She cataloged their sizes, their energy outputs, and their formation patterns. She noted which ships held position well and which ones drifted slightly, suggesting older navigation systems or undertrained crews. She noted intervals, how long each ship's drive cut out between pulses, how long their shield systems took between frequency rotations. She brought all of it to Admiral Voss every 12 hours, and Voss read every word. Ambassador Cithari watched this process from a respectful distance, mostly because he had nowhere else to go. And the council had quietly asked him to remain aboard the Meridian as an observer, which Cithari suspected was mostly because the council didn't want him in the chamber asking difficult questions while they finalized their surrender paperwork. He was given a small room with a working terminal and access to the ship's common areas, and he spent most of his time moving between those spaces and watching the humans work. It bothered him, not in a bad way. It bothered him the way something bothers you when you can't quite name it. On the third day of the chastening fleet's approach, he found Admiral Voss in the ship's small observation lounge late in the ship's night cycle, when most of the crew had rotated off duty. She was sitting at a table with 3 data tablets spread in front of her, a half-eaten meal pushed to one side, and a cup of cold coffee that she had clearly forgotten about. Cithari sat down across from her without being invited, one because he had decided that waiting to be invited was a luxury he no longer had. "You have been reading the historical records I brought," he said. It wasn't a question. He had seen her pull them up twice during their briefings. "I've read them 4 times, she said without looking up from the tablet. "And?" She looked up then. "Pull a chair over. I want to show you something." He pulled the chair closer. She turned one of the tablets around and showed him a timeline. It was a simple visual. Horizontal lines representing each of the 17 civilizations that had been erased following Valtari contact, plotted against the dates of their surrender transmissions and the dates they disappeared. "Look at the gaps," she said. He looked. In every case, there was a period between the surrender transmission and the disappearance of the civilization. It ranged from a few weeks to a few months. He had seen this data before. He had interpreted it as the Valthari taking their time to process the surrenders. "What am I looking at?" he asked. "You're looking at how long it took after the surrender transmission for each civilization to stop existing," Voss said. "Now look at this." She placed another tablet beside the first. It showed a different kind of data. Network traffic records compiled from ancient archive fragments. Every one of those civilizations, between their surrender and their disappearance, he transmitted detailed information to the Valthari. Population counts, infrastructure locations, fleet strength and positions. Some of them transmitted full star maps of their territories. Cithari was quiet. "They were following surrender protocol," she continued. "When you surrender to an occupying power, you hand over information so they can administer you. That's how it works. That's how they were thinking. But the Valthari weren't interested in administering anyone. They were collecting intelligence. The civilizations were handing them the exact information needed to erase them as efficiently as possible." Cithari stared at the timelines for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "The Galactic Council's surrender document includes population distribution data, infrastructure maps, fleet manifests." "Yes," said Voss. "I know." He sat back. Something cold moved through him. You've known this the whole time." "I suspected it when I read the records the first time. I was fairly sure by the second read. By the fourth, I was certain." She picked up her forgotten coffee, remembered it was cold, and set it back down. "The Valthari are 40,000 years old. That's real. Their ships are enormous and probably very powerful. None of that is a lie, but God isn't a description of what they are. It's a story they tell because it works. It works because every species they've ever met has believed it immediately and started behaving accordingly. And humans don't," Cithari said slowly. "Humans have a complicated relationship with being told something is impossible," Voss said. There was something in her expression that was not quite a smile. We tend to treat it as a starting point rather than a conclusion. Aboard Eternity's throne, the mood was very different. When the High Conclave had met twice since the chastening fleet was dispatched, and both meetings had been short because there was very little to discuss, the Council was preparing surrender terms. The humans had gone quiet after their single provocative transmission, which the Conclave had interpreted as the humans receiving their chastening fleet's approach on their sensors and thinking better of their position. This was, in fact, a reasonable interpretation. It was also completely wrong. To Fleet Commander Druath, who led the chastening wing, transmitted a routine status report on Day 4. The report noted that the human ship had not moved. It had not retreated, but it had not advanced either. It was simply sitting in the same position it had occupied since the beginning, which Druath read as confusion or indecision on the human commander's part. He had encountered that before. Sometimes young species froze when they finally understood what was coming. It was not unusual. It would resolve itself the moment the chastening fleet arrived, and they saw the firepower arrayed against them. What Druath did not notice was that his fleet's drive signatures were changing the shape of the surrounding space just enough to be measured by very sensitive equipment. What he did not notice was that the human ship's long-range passive arrays were 10 years more advanced than anything the Valthari had ever encountered from a species this young. Because humanity had spent decades developing sensor technology for deep space mineral surveys, and the same equipment that found rare metals in asteroid fields was extremely good at mapping the technical details of approaching warships. What he did not notice was that the human admiral had, over 4 days, built a technical profile of his 14 ships that was more detailed than the engineering documents his own crews worked from. He did not notice any of this because it had never happened before. When he thought about the human ship sitting alone and motionless in deep space, he thought, "It is afraid. It has nowhere to run. It is waiting to see if surrender will be accepted." He did not think, "It is studying us." The thought genuinely did not occur to him. On the 5th day, Sithari asked to sit in on the bridge briefing. Voss allowed it. And he stood quietly at the back of the bridge while Anon walked the assembled officers through the latest analysis of the approaching fleet. The 14 ships were now close enough for more detailed readings, and the picture they had built was extensive. Ship 7 has an irregular thruster signature on the port side, Anon said, highlighting the relevant data on the main display. Drive plasma venting on the lower array. It's not severe enough to ground the ship, but it's been consistent for 3 days, which means it's a known issue they haven't fixed. Probably because they didn't think this deployment warranted a repair stop. In an engagement, that ship is going to have limited mobility options turning to port. Ship 3 and Ship 11 are running synchronized shield rotations, said Ensign Barath from the tactical station. He was young, barely 2 years out of the academy, but he had been thorough. They're probably assigned to each other as a support pair. If one is targeted, the other will move to cover. We can use that predictability. Ship 1 is the command vessel, Anon continued. Drive output is higher than the others, better maintained. Shields cycle faster. Weapons arrays show higher power allocation. If the commander's worth anything, that's where they'll be coordinating from. Voss stood with her hands loosely behind her back and listened to all of it. When Anon finished, Voss asked 3 questions about power recovery times and got 3 precise answers. Then she turned to look at the tactical display, which showed the positions of all 14 approaching ships laid out in a clean formation. They're flying the same formation they've probably flown for thousands of years, she said. Same approach vector, same spacing. They've never had a reason to change it. They don't know we're mapping them, Anon said. They can't imagine we are, Voss replied. Oh no, that's not the same thing. Sithari, watching from the back, found that he had unclenched his hands without noticing. He looked down at his open palms, then back up at the main display. 14 massive warships, 1 human battleship. The math was catastrophically simple. And yet, standing in this room, watching these people work, he felt something strange beginning to happen inside him. It was not confidence exactly. He was not human, and he did not know if he was capable of the particular kind of confidence he was observing. But it was adjacent to it. It was the feeling of standing next to someone who had thought about a problem much harder than you had, and finding that the problem had, in the process, become a different shape than you thought. After the briefing, as the officers filed out, Sathari moved to stand beside Voss at the tactical display. Tomorrow, he said. It was not quite a question. Tomorrow, she confirmed. You're keeping the ship here. One ship against 14. 14 ships that haven't fought a real engagement in centuries, Voss said. 14 ships whose crews have spent their careers watching species surrender without a shot fired. 14 ships whose commanders have never had to adapt mid-engagement because every engagement they've ever been in ended before it could become an engagement. She looked at him directly. They have 40,000 years of history, but history isn't the same as experience. If you've spent 40,000 years doing the same thing to the same result, you don't have 40,000 years of experience. You have 1 year of experience 40,000 times. Sithari thought about that for a long moment. Something about it hit him in a place he had not expected. Your people have fought each other, he said slowly, for thousands of years before you reached the stars. Voss nodded. Sonya, all that time, he continued, working through it. Your tactics changed. Your technology changed. Every time one side developed something new, the other side had to respond. Adapt or lose. Always, always adapt. We've had a lot of painful teachers, she said simply. He was quiet. Then he said, the Vilethari have had none. None, she confirmed. Until now. He looked at the display, at the 14 shapes moving through the dark toward them. He thought about 40,000 years of silence. He thought about how silence long enough stops being peaceful and starts being something else entirely. Ambassador, Voss said, turning from the display, I'd recommend getting some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day. She walked toward the bridge door, unhurried. As she reached it, she paused and glanced back. And whatever happens, she said, don't transmit the Council's surrender document. Not yet, especially not the infrastructure maps. Then she was gone, and Sithari stood alone in the briefing room with the display showing 14 approaching ships, thinking about a question that had not occurred to him until this moment. Not whether humanity could survive tomorrow, but whether the Vilethari had any idea what was about to happen to them. He thought they did not. He thought they truly, completely did not. The chastening fleet arrived at dawn by ship's clock. There was no actual dawn in deep space, of course, but the unbroken meridian ran on a 24-hour cycle because human bodies needed rhythm, and the crew had come on shift at 0600, just as they always did. They ate breakfast. They checked their stations. They ran diagnostics that had already been run twice the night before. They talked in low voices and drank coffee and did all the ordinary things people do when they are waiting for something that is not ordinary at all. Honorary Voss arrived on the bridge at 0610 with a fresh cup of coffee and a calm expression. She sat in her command chair, pulled up the tactical display, and looked at the 14 incoming drive signatures that had grown from distant specks into something much more defined over the past 12 hours. Range, she asked. 40,000 kilometers in closing, Annan said. They'll be in standard engagement range in approximately 11 minutes. Weapons? Ready, said Barath from Tactical. Railgun batteries 1 through 6 are hot. Missile bays are loaded. Point defense is on automatic. Our shields? Full power. All bands rotating on the new intervals you approved. Voss nodded. She had changed the Meridian's shield rotation intervals 2 days ago, setting them to a pattern that was non-standard and irregular. The Vilethari would not have data on it. They would have to spend time learning to target through it, and time today was a resource she intended to control. Sithari stood at the back of the bridge, near the wall where he was out of the way. He had not slept well. He was fairly sure he looked like he had not slept well. One of the junior crew members had quietly brought him something to eat that morning, and he had eaten it without tasting any of it. Now he watched the display and watched Voss and tried to understand what calm felt like from the inside. The chastening fleet came out of their final approach burn and arranged themselves in a wide forward arc. Their formation was practiced and precise, the same formation they used in every chastening engagement because it had always worked, because the target was always still and waiting to surrender by the time they arrived. Fleet Commander Druath looked at his display and saw the single human ship sitting exactly where it had sat for 6 days. It had not moved. It had not retreated. It was simply there, alone, in the middle of empty space. Dreth studied it for a moment. It was smaller than he expected for a military vessel of a species attempting resistance. Long and narrow, built in layers with clearly visible weapons arrays and a sensor cluster at the forward end that was larger than seemed reasonable. It was not an impressive-looking ship. It was not threatening. It was, by any measure he knew, outnumbered and outmatched 14-1. He activated the chastening transmission, a ritual sequence his fleet had used for centuries. Ancient words carried forward from the earliest days of the Valthari Dominion's expansion. His voice went out across all frequencies. You are addressed by the chastening fleet of the Valthari Dominion, voice of the Archons, will of eternity. You stand before the chosen of the universe, the first and the final civilization. Your defiance has been noted and your correction is at hand. Submit now. To transmit acknowledgement of surrender, in the Archon's mercy will be extended to your people. This is the last word you will receive before correction begins. There was a pause of perhaps 4 seconds. Then the response came back. It was a single human voice. Female. Calm, not loud. Fleet Commander, this is Admiral Mara Voss of the United Earthship Unbroken Meridian. We've been watching your drive signatures for 6 days. We know your recharge intervals. When we know your shield rotation frequencies, we know which of your 14 ships has a faulty port thruster because it's been venting plasma since you dropped out of FTL. We know your command ship is Vessel 1 by power output and response latency. We've been waiting for you to fire first so the record is clean. Whenever you're ready. Druth stared at the communications panel. Then, because the words did not entirely make sense to him in any framework he understood, he ordered his fleet to fire. 14 targeting systems locked onto the position of the Unbroken Meridian. 14 weapons batteries discharged simultaneously, because coordination on the opening salvo was a standard part of the chastening protocol. It was a display of power. The intention was not necessarily to destroy the target immediately, but to demonstrate the absolute futility of resistance. A wall of energy and kinetic force descending all at once. Overwhelming, inescapable. Except the Unbroken Meridian was not there anymore. It had moved in the 3-second window between Voss's transmission ending and the weapons firing. Not far, barely 12 kilometers, which in the scale of space was almost nothing. But 12 kilometers in the specific direction that Voss's analysis of the Valthari targeting pattern had predicted, based on 6 days of observing how their targeting arrays adjusted and led moving targets. The salvo hit empty space. The energy dissipated. The kinetic rounds tumbled off into the dark. Druth stared at his display. The human ship had moved. He processed this information. He ordered the targeting systems to reacquire. The Unbroken Meridian's first railgun salvo hit Ship 7, the one with the damaged port thruster, in the starboard engine cluster. Railgun rounds at full velocity were simple things, just dense metal moving very fast. But simple things did not need to be complicated to be effective. Ship 7's engine cluster failed. The ship began to drift, slowly, port side, its damaged thruster the only one still firing at any useful level, pushing the vessel into an increasingly uncontrolled arc. Ship 11, which was Ship 7's assigned support partner, did exactly what Voss's tactical model predicted. It broke formation and moved to intercept, placing itself between Ship 7 and the Meridian to provide cover. The Meridian fired 3 missiles at the gap that Ship 11 had just left in the formation. The gap was exactly where the analysis said it would be. The missiles were already moving before Ship 11 had finished relocating. 2 of the 3 missiles hit Ship 4, which had been behind Ship 11 and was now exposed. Ship 4's shields managed the first impact but failed partway through the second, and the 3rd missile hit hull directly. The explosion was significant. Ship 4 went dark. On the Meridian's bridge, nobody cheered. There was no time for cheering. Barath was already calling out the next targeting solution. Annan was tracking the formation's response, feeding updates to the tactical model in real time. Voss was watching everything and thinking about the next 3 moves simultaneously. The way you do when you have spent 6 days building a map of exactly this situation, and now you are walking through it with the map in your hand. Druth had been in the chastening fleet for 200 years. He had participated in 31 chastening engagements. In all 31, the protocol had been the same. Arrive, transmit, Fire if necessary, except surrender. The firing had almost never been necessary. When it was over quickly, because nothing had ever been prepared to respond to it. He had not been prepared for this. The human ship moved constantly. It did not move in random directions. When it moved in specific directions at specific moments, as if it somehow knew where the incoming fire was going to be before the fire was there. Drath's targeting officers were working as fast as they could, but every time they achieved a solid lock, the target shifted just enough. Not far, just enough. And every time the Meridian fired, it fired at something real. Ship 3 was hit in the power relay section. Its shields collapsed, and it went to emergency systems, which cut its weapons offline while the crew rerouted power. Ship 9 took a railgun salvo along the forward hull that damaged its primary sensor array. Now Ship 9 was effectively firing half-blind, its targeting dependent on data relayed from other ships, adding a lag to everything it did. Drath ordered his formation to collapse inward, concentrating fire. Standard response to a maneuvering target. If the target could not avoid the entire formation simultaneously by moving, the targeting problem would simplify. The Meridian responded by moving toward the gap in the formation created by the disabled Ship 7 and the now repositioned Ship 11. It moved through the gap, briefly surrounded on partial sides, its point defense systems firing constantly to handle the incoming missiles. Its own weapons firing continuously. From inside the formation, the attack angles were harder. The Valthari ships were now firing at each other's general direction, having to account for their own allies in the targeting solutions. Two ships briefly ceased fire rather than risk hitting a formation partner. Drath realized with a cold and very unfamiliar feeling that the human commander had maneuvered him into this, that the human commander had somehow predicted he would collapse the formation and had prepared a response to that response in advance. He had never had to think more than one step ahead before. He did not know how to think 4 steps ahead, and he did not know that was something you needed to learn. 40 minutes after the first shot was fired, 9 of the 14 Valthari warships were unable to fight effectively. 3 were disabled by direct damage to propulsion or power systems. 2 had suffered shield failures and were now managing casualties from hull breaches. 1 had lost its primary command relay and was operating on backup systems with reduced coordination. 3 more had damaged weapon systems, which still maneuvering but largely unable to contribute offensive fire. Ship 4 was destroyed. Ship 12, which had moved to assist Ship 4 and positioned itself badly, had been caught by a missile salvo in its most exposed quadrant and had broken apart. The crew of Ship 12 had had time to reach escape pods. Voss had noted this and had not targeted the escape pods. 2 ships had broken formation entirely and were retreating, burning hard in the direction they had come from. Drath, aboard the command ship, had not ordered the retreat. They had simply gone. He stared at his display. The human ship was still moving, still firing, still exactly where his models said it shouldn't be able to be. Its shields had taken real damage. He could see the energy fluctuations. It was not invulnerable. It was not magically protected. Whatever it was doing through preparation and movement and an understanding of his fleet's behavior that felt to Drath deeply wrong. As if the human commander had read his mind. She hadn't read his mind. She had read his data. But to Drath, who had never been studied before, the difference was invisible. He transmitted a hold order to his remaining ships. He sat in the silence of his command chamber and did something he had not done in 200 years of service. He thought about losing. Aboard Eternity's throne, the High Conclave had been watching the battlefield since the first minute. Nobody spoke, and the chamber was very still. On the display, the engagement continued to update in real time. The positions of the ships, the energy signatures, the damage reports coming in from the chastening fleet. The numbers were clear. The outcome was clear. One of the younger Conclave members, a Valthari commander named Shrell, who had spent 60 years in the military and had a reputation for careful thinking, looked at the battlefield and then looked at Velsharath. Supreme Archon, Shrell said carefully. 1 ship. Velsharath said nothing. 1 human ship, Shrell continued, has done this to 14 of ours. The chamber remained silent, but on Velsharath's ancient armored face, something had changed. It was very small. If you did not know what to look for, you would miss it entirely. It was the look of a being who has just encountered something it cannot explain. In 40,000 years, Velshareth had encountered very few things he could not explain. He had always found the experience uncomfortable. He found it very uncomfortable now. He watched the display as the two retreating Valthari ships burned away from the engagement zone, and he watched the single human battleship turn in space and take up a steady, unhurried position in the middle of the debris field it had created. It was not chasing the retreating ships. It was not firing on the escape pods. It was not broadcasting victory or demands. It was simply sitting there, waiting. Velshareth had spent 40,000 years being the thing that other beings feared. He looked at the display, at the small human ship holding steady in the wreckage of his chastening fleet, and he felt something enter his chest that he did not have a name for. Somewhere in a species he had not bothered to look up until a week ago, there was a word for it. They called it fear, and the name, when they gave it, Anna, was very accurate. The battle recording ran for 43 minutes and 17 seconds. The Galactic Council had received the live feed through a relay beacon that the Unbroken Meridian had positioned and activated without announcement 2 days before the engagement. It had transmitted everything, not just the weapons fire and ship positions, but the full sensor overlay, the tactical model updates, and the audio from the open communication channels. Every ambassador in the council chamber had watched the entire thing in real time, and now 3 hours later, they were watching it again. Nobody had suggested stopping the playback. The Dorathi ambassador sat perfectly still, all four arms flat on his desk, which was the Dorathi posture of deep shock. The Kaylee group had not moved from their seats. The Sin, who were usually the most vocal species in the chamber, had not said a word since the recording began its second run. Sathari was not in the chamber. Sathari was still on the Unbroken Meridian, standing at the viewport in the observation lounge, looking at the debris field that had been 14 warships. He had been standing there for 2 hours. He was not thinking about the battle specifically. He was thinking about a thing Voss had said to him several nights ago, about experience versus history, about doing one thing 40,000 times and calling it wisdom. And he had understood the words when she said them. He understood them differently now, having watched what those words meant when they were demonstrated in practice. One of the Meridian's crew, a young engineering tech named Farran, came into the lounge at some point and asked Sathari if he needed anything. Sathari said no. Farran left. Then Sathari called him back and asked for water because he realized his throat was dry, which was what happened to Rethians when they spent a long time in a state of suspended disbelief. He drank the water slowly and looked at the wreckage outside and thought about 40,000 years. The question the council could not stop asking was the simple one. How, not why. Not what comes next. Just how. How did one ship do what 43 minutes of recording clearly showed it doing? How did a single battleship, from a species barely 400 years into faster-than-light travel, dismantle 14 warships from the oldest and most powerful civilization in the known galaxy? It was Sathari who eventually explained it, via recorded message, because he could not physically return to the chamber immediately, and because the council was going to keep watching the battle recording in confused silence until someone gave them a framework. He recorded the message sitting in the observation lounge, with the debris field visible behind him through the viewport. When he told them what Voss had told him, he told them about the 6 days of passive observation, about the technical profiles built from emissions data, about the tactical model that had mapped the chastening fleet's every characteristic before the first shot was fired. He told them about the shield rotation intervals, the support pair behavior, the command ship identification, the damage thruster on Ship 7. Then he paused for a moment. Hirani said the part that he had been thinking about for 2 hours. The Valthari fleet did not lose because humanity has better weapons or stronger shields or more advanced technology. In direct comparison, by technical specification alone, 14 Valthari warships should have been more than sufficient to destroy one human battleship. The Valthari fleet lost because it was fought by someone who had spent 6 days learning exactly how it would behave, and it behaved exactly as predicted, or because it has never had a reason to behave differently. He looked into the recorder. Humanity, he said, has been fighting itself for as long as it has existed. Wars on their home world, wars in their early colonies, wars over resources and beliefs and borders, and 100 other things we consider ourselves too civilized to fight over. Every war they fought changed them. Every time one side developed a new weapon or a new tactic, the other side had to respond, or lose. They never stopped adapting because they were never allowed to stop. They brought all of that with them when they came to the stars. He stopped again. Then he said more quietly, "The Valthari have not had a real enemy in 40,000 years. They have had victims. There is a difference. Admiral Voss is not a miracle. She is what happens when a species has been forced to produce people like her, generation after generation, for thousands of years, and never had the luxury of stopping." He ended the recording and sent it. On eternity's throne, the high conclave was fracturing. It was not a loud fracture. The Valthari were not a species that expressed disagreement through noise. But the silence in the conclave chamber had taken on different weights in different corners of the room, and Velsharth could feel the difference. Israel, the younger commander, spoke first. He spoke carefully, but he spoke directly, which was notable. Its directness in the Valthari conclave usually meant the speaker had decided that the ordinary caution of political language was no longer an adequate tool. "We do not know how many ships they have," Sorel said. "We do not know how many commanders they have who are capable of what this one did. We have no useful intelligence on human space. We sent our chastening fleet in without intelligence because we have never needed intelligence. Yet the outcome of that decision is on our display. We will deploy the primary wings," said one of the older conclave members, Archon Varath. Her voice was flat and certain. "The Ascendant Arcs carry weapons that can crack planets. No amount of tactical cleverness survives a cracked planet." "And how many planets are in human space?" Azrael asked. "We do not know. We do not know their colony count. We do not know their population distribution. We do not know how many warships they currently have in production. We know almost nothing, because we have never needed to know anything about anyone. We have arrived and been submitted to. That is the entirety of our intelligence methodology." Varath's expression did not change. "The primary wings, could we deploy the primary wings into unknown space against an enemy we cannot map, managed by commanders who have never fought an actual campaign?" Srel said. He let the question sit for a moment. "The chastening fleet was led by one of our most experienced commanders. He had 200 years of service. He managed 31 engagements without a single failure. He failed today because the situation was outside every framework he had ever been trained to manage." The chamber was quiet. "If we escalate," Israel continued, "we are not escalating from a position of knowledge. We are escalating from a position of wounded pride. And we will be doing it against a species that, by the evidence before us, is significantly more prepared to fight a real war than we are." Velsharath listened to all of this without speaking. He had not spoken since the battlefield ended. The others had been speaking around him, waiting for his word, but he had given none. He was thinking. 40,000 years of thinking had made Velsharth very good at it. He could hold multiple frameworks in his mind simultaneously and turn them. The way you turn a stone to see all its faces. He was turning the framework of this situation now, looking at every face. Face 1. The Valthari were the dominant power in the known galaxy. This was a fact supported by 40,000 years of history. Face 2. One human ship had dismantled a fleet of 14 in 43 minutes. Face 3. They knew almost nothing about human space, its size, its fleet strength, its industrial capacity, its other commanders. Phase 4. Humanity had not surrendered, had not negotiated, had not attempted to escape. It had simply fought, effectively, as if fighting was something it did naturally and without particular stress. Phase 5. If humanity had commanders like the woman who had fought today, and there was no reason to believe it had only one, and if humanity's fleet strength was proportional to the confidence with which it had responded to the initial Valthari declaration, then escalation was not a solution. It was a gamble of the worst kind, a gamble taken in ignorance. He turned the stone. He looked at all the faces. Then slowly he spoke. "Suspend the deployment order for the primary wings," he said. "Open intelligence reviews on human territorial space. I want population models, fleet estimates, and industrial capacity projections by whatever means available. Varath turned to look at him. Supreme Archon, at our authority, will mean nothing if we commit it fully to a campaign we cannot map and cannot win, Velsharath said. His voice was quiet. It was always quiet, but it had a quality that made other Valthari stop moving when they heard it. I have not survived 40,000 years by refusing to update my understanding when facts demanded it. The facts are demanding it now. He looked at the display, where the debris field and the single unmoving human ship were still visible. With this species, he said very slowly, is not what we thought they were. Voss, unaware of the conclave's internal arguments, spent the hours after the engagement doing the things that needed doing. She walked the bridge and spoke to each officer personally. She visited the medical bay, where 11 crew members had been injured during the engagement, mostly from impact jolts when the ship's maneuvering systems pushed hard limits. Nothing fatal. She sat with the two who were worst off for a few minutes each and talked with them about ordinary things. She had found over the years that ordinary conversation was more useful than formal encouragement after a hard day. Encouragement implied things had been frightening. Ordinary conversation treated them as normal, which was a better thing to believe. She wrote her after-action report in the late hours of the ship's evening. It was detailed and precise. Watched it because good reports save future lives by giving future commanders accurate information. She included the full technical analysis of the Valthari fleet, everything Anand had built, as an appendix. She flagged the passive sensor methodology as a recommended standard protocol for any future engagement where observation time was available. She was writing the report's conclusion section when Sethari appeared in her doorway. She looked up. "You should sleep," she said. "I have questions," he said. "There'll still be valid questions in the morning." He came in and sat down anyway, which she had expected. She set down her stylus and waited. "Your people," he said. "All those wars, all that fighting, was it worth it?" She thought about the question honestly, the way it deserved. "Ask the people who died in them, and the answer is probably no," she said. "Ask the people who exist because of what came out of them, including me, and the answer is more complicated. We didn't choose to be shaped the way we were shaped. It just happened, over a very long time, and here we are." "But you're not sorry for it," he said. "What it made you." She considered. "I'm not sorry for being what I am. I'm sorry for a lot of the things that made me what I am. Those are different feelings, and they can both be true." Sethuri was quiet. Then he said, "The Council is going to want to discuss a formal response to today, a diplomatic framing of what happened. I expect they'll want humanity to be part of that conversation, officially, in a way you haven't been before." "That seems like a reasonable thing to discuss," Voss said. "But not tonight." "No," he agreed. "Not tonight." He stood up, moved toward the door, then paused. "Admiral," he said, "you could have destroyed all 14 of them." She said nothing. "You chose not to," he continued. "Ships 11 and 13 were fully disabled with live crews. You had clear firing solutions. Why, you didn't take them." "Disabled is disabled," she said. "I didn't need them destroyed. I needed the engagement to end." He looked at her for a moment. "That distinction," he said, "is also something not every species chooses to make." He left. Voss sat alone in her small office and thought about that for a while. Then she picked up her stylus and went back to the report. There was still work to finish, and the morning was going to bring a great deal of complexity with it. She preferred to meet complexity with her work already done. 3 days after the battle, Eternity's throne opened a direct channel to the unbroken meridian. No ritual words preceded it, no formal title sequence, no declaration of authority, no ancient language of the Valthari dominion read aloud in the way it had always been read before every significant communication. The channel simply opened, and a voice came through, deep and slow and immeasurably old, but stripped of everything ceremonial, just a voice, talking. Voss was on the bridge when the channel opened. She listened to the initial silence for 2 seconds, then nodded to Ensign Dale to open the response line. "This is Admiral Voss," she said. Another brief silence, then, "I am Velsharath, Supreme Archon of the Valthari Dominion." A pause. "I speak to you without title, without the language of authority. I am told you would understand this better than ceremony. Voss glanced at Cithari, who had become a permanent quiet presence on the bridge over the past 3 days. He stood a little straighter, surprised. I understand it just fine, Voss said. I have questions, Belshazzar said. I find at this point in my existence that questions are unfamiliar. I have spent a very long time providing answers. Go ahead, she said. What does your species want? He asked. Not diplomatically, sir, not formally, plainly. What does humanity want from this? The bridge was very quiet. Everyone was listening. Outside, the debris of the chastening fleet still drifted slowly through the belt, and beyond it, barely visible on the long-range display, the dark mass of the Valthari arcs sat motionless. Voss thought about the question for a moment, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to give it properly. Belshazzar had just done something that probably cost him enormously, in terms of what it meant to his identity and his place in his own civilization. He had asked a question without claiming to already know the answer. That deserved a real response. Nothing from you, she said. We want you to leave. We want you to leave every world that is currently under your authority that would rather not be. And we want every species in the Galactic Council to know that if another chastening fleet enters our space, or anyone else's space who asks for our help, the answer will be the same as this one. Except next time, we won't wait for the first shot. A long silence. That is all? Belshazzar asked. That's all? No territory claim, no reparations, no demand for submission of our own. We don't want your submission, Voss said. We never wanted yours. We just want to be left alone, and to leave others alone, that is, genuinely, the whole thing. Another silence. Much longer this time. Long enough that Diel checked the channel to confirm it was still open. It was. When Belshazzar spoke again, his voice had changed in some way that was difficult to name. It was not weaker. It was not defeated. It was something more like a man sitting down after standing for a very long time. I have led my people for longer than your written history, he said. And in all that time, no species has ever asked only to be left alone. They have asked for mercy. They have offered tribute. They have negotiated the terms of their survival. But no one has ever simply asked us to go away. Did it work? Voss asked. Silence. No, he said. It did not. Then that might be why it took us to say it, she said. The Galactic Council received the full audio transmission 11 minutes later, relayed through the beacon the Meridian had positioned. It spread from there the way important things spread. First along official diplomatic channels, then along every informal network and private relay and personal communication line that ran through 31 species and hundreds of worlds. By the time the day was over, every inhabited planet within range of a functioning communications network had heard it at least once. Belshazzar's voice, stripped of ceremony, asking what humanity wanted. Voss's voice, calm and direct, in answering with a list that contained exactly 3 things. The effect was different in different places. On several worlds that had existed under Valthari protection, a word that meant, in practice, the specific kind of helpfulness that nobody had asked for and nobody could refuse. The transmission was played back in public spaces. In some places, crowds gathered to listen. In some places, nobody spoke for a long time afterward. In some places, how many people who had spent generations being careful about what they said in public began to say the things they had been careful about because something had shifted, and the shift once made was not easily unmade. In the Galactic Council chamber, the recording played on the main display while 31 species listened in silence. When it ended, nobody spoke for a full 30 seconds. Then the Darathi ambassador said, in his own language, the word that his species used for the moment when something very large and very established begins to move. There was not a direct translation, but every being in the room understood what he meant. Belshazzar gave the withdrawal order from Eternity's throne 2 hours after his conversation with Voss. It was not a dramatic order. He did not gather the conclave and make a speech. Or he did not frame it as a strategic repositioning or a tactical adjustment or any of the other words that would have allowed the reality of it to be softened into something more palatable. He simply called the fleet commander of the Arkwing and said, "We are withdrawing from Kareth's belt. Prepare the fleet for FTL departure." The fleet commander, a careful being who had served Velshareth long enough to read his moods accurately, asked no questions. He began the preparation sequence. Washarel found Velshareth standing at the main viewport of the command chamber, looking out at the stars. Sorel came and stood beside him, which was the Vilthari way of indicating you were available to speak if the other person wanted to, but were not demanding it. For a long time, neither of them said anything. Then Velshareth said, "I have been thinking about the civilizations we erased." Sorel said nothing. "I did not think about them as civilizations," Velshareth continued. I thought about them as incomplete things, things that had not yet learned their place. We were helping the galaxy, I believed, ordering it, making it function correctly. He paused. I believed this because no one had ever told me otherwise, in a way that I was required to take seriously. The humans told you otherwise, Sorel said carefully. The humans told me otherwise in a language I could not dismiss. He looked at the stars. Force is a language, Sorel. I understand it. I respect it in the way that I respect anything that is real and cannot be argued away. What will you do? Sorel asked. Velshareth was quiet for a moment. I will change the chastening doctrine. Formally, from the law of the Dominion, we will not chastise again. He paused. I will also begin a review of our current protectorates. Those who wish to renegotiate their status, that conversation will now be available to them. The Conclave will not accept all of this easily, Sorel said. No, Velshareth agreed. They will not. But I am 40,000 years old and I have a great deal of patience for difficult conversations. He glanced at Esrael. And I am newly persuaded that refusing to update one's understanding when facts demand it is not wisdom. It is simply a choice to remain wrong. Outside, through the viewport, the first of the ascendant arcs began its slow turn, preparing for FTL. It moved with the same vast, unhurried certainty it had always moved with. But something was different now, something internal, something that did not show in the movement of the ship but lived inside the beings aboard it. A question had been asked, and it could not be unasked. A question that started with, what if we have been wrong? That question, once genuinely asked, has a way of not stopping. Sithari watched the Vilthari arcs prepare to leave from the observation lounge of the Unbroken Meridian. He had been in this lounge a great deal recently, and it had a good viewport, and he had found over the past several days that he needed to look at things rather than at data screens. Data screens showed you information. Viewports showed you reality, and right now reality was what he needed to look at. He heard footsteps and turned. Voss came in carrying 2 cups. She handed him one without asking and stood beside him at the viewport. Coffee, she said. Or as close as our galley gets to it. We've been on station long enough that supplies are getting creative. He took the cup. It was warm, which was the important part. They stood together and watched the enormous dark shapes of the Vilthari fleet begin their departure. One by one, the arcs aligned for their FTL jumps. One by one, they disappeared into the brightness of transition, leaving nothing behind but the fading light of their drive signatures. The last one went. The belt was empty again, except for the debris, and the meridian, and the slow turning of distant stars. It's over, Sithari said. He was testing the words, seeing how they felt. This part is, Voss said. He understood what she meant. The conversation that had begun here was not over. Across the council, things were moving. Species that had been quiet for a long time were finding their voices. Planets that had accepted terms they had not wanted were beginning to question whether those terms were still the only option. In the Vilthari withdrawal was real, but what came after it, the renegotiation, the restructuring, the long and complicated process of a galaxy realigning itself, that would take years, maybe decades. But it had started. Here, with one transmission and one battle and one conversation on an open channel. I want to ask you something, Sithari said, and I want you to answer honestly. I'll do my best, Voss said. When the chastening fleet arrived, he said, when you were sitting here, in one ship, knowing what was coming, were you afraid? She thought about it. She looked at the empty space where the Vilthari fleet had been. Yes, she said. 14 warships. Any one of them probably outweighed us in raw firepower. Of course I was afraid. Sithari looked at her. You didn't seem afraid. Fear isn't something you show when you're working, she said. It's information. It tells you something needs solving. So you take the fear and you turn it into a problem. And then you solve the problem. She took a sip from her cup. We've been doing that as a species for a long time. It's probably the one thing we're actually best at. Sithari held his cup and thought about that. He thought about humanity's long history of making problems out of fear and then solving them. He thought about the long, painful, expensive, wasteful, relentless process that had produced someone like Mara Voss. He thought about all the cost of it, on all the generations of conflict and loss that had gone into shaping a species that responded to a God claim by asking for weapon specs. He thought about whether it was worth it. He decided that the answer depended entirely on which day you were asking the question. Today, standing in a lounge on a human warship, watching the last traces of the Vilthari fleet fade from the sensors, with 31 species beginning, slowly and carefully, to breathe differently. Today, the answer felt like yes. What happens now, he asked. Voss lowered her cup. We file reports. We go home. The diplomats do the diplomacy. We do whatever's next. She paused. That's always what's next. For us. Whatever's next. She turned and walked toward the bridge door, unhurried, steady, as she always was. Sithari looked back out the viewport for a long moment. The belt was quiet again. Stars burned their slow fires behind the dark. The debris drifted, and somewhere among it, on an escape pod from Ship 12, was broadcasting a recovery beacon that a Vilthari rescue vessel had been dispatched to answer 2 days ago. Voss had confirmed the rescue dispatch before transmitting her after-action report. He had seen that in the documents. It was one line in a very long report. She had not drawn attention to it. That was the part that he kept coming back to. In the middle of everything, the battle, the tactical calculations, with a history being made, she had made sure someone was coming for the crew of Ship 12. He stood there a while longer, until the coffee cooled, and then he walked back to the small room that had been his for the past week and began writing his own report to the council. He wrote for a long time. He wrote carefully, because he wanted to get it right. He wrote about the Vilthari and the battle and the withdrawal, all of which the council already knew. He wrote about Velsherath's call and Voss's answer, which the council had heard. And then he wrote something that was not in any of the data feeds or transmissions, something he had observed over the course of a week aboard this ship that he thought the council needed to understand. He wrote, "Humanity does not believe it is special. That is the most important thing I can tell you. They do not understand themselves as a chosen species or a destined power or the inheritors of any particular cosmic role. They think of themselves as practical. They think of themselves as problem solvers. They are aware of their history and they are not entirely proud of it, but they carry it with them honestly. And they have built from it something that no amount of age or power or ancient authority could have predicted. They are not gods. They have never claimed to be. That is precisely why. And when gods showed up, they simply asked for a D. He read the paragraph back. Then he decided it was the right ending for his report and left it as it was. Outside his small window, the stars continued to burn, the debris continued to drift, and the unbroken meridian turned slowly in the dark. Heading home, carrying its crew, carrying its record, carrying the quiet and ordinary dignity of a species that had looked at 40,000 years of power and asked, us simply and clearly, is that the best you've got? And meant it.